In this episode of our Classical Music Discoveries education series, we embark on a sweeping journey through time to explore how the symphony orchestra became the magnificent, expressive instrument we know today. From its modest Baroque beginnings to the monumental forces of the Romantic era and the bold innovations of the modern age, the orchestra's evolution mirrors the changing imagination of composers and the expanding possibilities of musical storytelling. Guiding today's discussion are our esteemed hosts, Dr. William Kenney, retired professor of music from the University of Kansas, whose deep historical insight illuminates the orchestra's development with clarity and scholarship. Maestra Cavanaugh, conductor of the CMD Grand Opera Company of Venice, whose artistic perspective brings the orchestra's expressive power vividly to life. Together, Dr. Kenney and Maestra Cavanaugh trace the orchestra's transformation across centuries, its shifting size, color, balance, and purpose, revealing how each generation of composers reshaped the ensemble to serve new artistic visions. Join us as we uncover the symphony orchestra's grand evolution, one era, one innovation, one brilliant sound at a time.
Here's something that will reframe everything you think you know about classical music. The symphony orchestra, that grand, awe-inspiring institution filling concert halls around the world, started as background noise. Literally. It was the warm-up act before the opera curtain rose, and audiences weren't even supposed to pay attention to it. Today, we're tracing how that throwaway overture became the most ambitious and prestigious instrumental form in Western music. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how the orchestra grew from a handful of string players into a 120-piece powerhouse, which composers drove those changes, and why the tension between tradition and innovation is still very much alive today. I've got someone here who lives and breathes this history, so let's get into it. What's the first thing people get wrong when they picture the early orchestra?
The biggest misconception is that the orchestra always looked the way it does now, this massive, organized ensemble with 4 distinct sections. That's actually a very recent invention in historical terms. For most of music history, when musicians got together to play, they used whatever instruments were around. There was no blueprint.
Whatever was lying around, that's kind of wild to picture.
Right. And according to the Phoenix Symphony's history of the orchestra, it wasn't until about 400 years ago that musicians started forming combinations that would eventually turn into the modern orchestra. Before that, in the Renaissance around the 1500s, a group of instrumentalists playing together was just called a consort, and composers would write parts that could be played on virtually any instrument. The music wasn't written for specific sounds, it was written for whoever showed up.
So it was almost like a jam session by today's standards.
In a way, yeah. And then around 1600, one composer completely changed that. Claudio Monteverdi, writing his opera Orfeo in 1607, knew exactly which instruments and sounds he wanted. He specified them in the score. That was genuinely radical. His ensemble was starting to look like what we'd recognize as a modern orchestra. Instruments organized into sections, lots of bowed strings, a real variety of timbres.
So Monteverdi is basically the person who said, no, I want this specific sound, not just whatever you brought to rehearsal.
Exactly. And that shift from any instrument will do to I need these specific instruments is the foundational move that makes the modern orchestra possible. It's the moment composition and orchestration become inseparable.
And here's something I find fascinating. Even the word orchestra has ancient roots, right? It's not a modern invention.
It goes all the way back to ancient Greek theater. According to Britannica, the word comes from the Greek orchestra, which was the circular space in front of the stage where dancers and instrumentalists performed. So the name predates the ensemble by centuries. The concept of a dedicated performance space for musicians is that old.
That's a detail I did not expect. Okay, so we've got Monteverdi organizing things around 1600. What happens next in the Baroque era?
The Baroque era is where you start to see real instrumentation technique develop. Composers like Bach, Handel, and Vivaldi were working with smaller ensembles, strings, woodwinds, some brass. Bach's Brandenburg concertos, written between 1717 and 1721, are a great example. They feature a range of solo instruments, including harpsichord and violin, and they show incredible skill in writing for a smaller orchestra. But the ensemble is still relatively modest.
And the harpsichord is at the center of all of this during the Baroque period.
Completely central. And here's the thing about the harpsichord that people don't always appreciate. According to the Piano Encyclopedia, it used a plucking mechanism that produced a bright timbre, but it confined performers to a very limited dynamic range. You literally could not play louder or softer by pressing harder or softer on the keys. Every note was essentially the same volume, which is a fascinating constraint when you think about it.
Wait, so the instrument at the heart of Baroque music couldn't actually express dynamics? That seems like a massive limitation.
It is, and it shaped everything about how music was written in that era. The emotional range had to come from other places, from counterpoint, from rhythm, from the interplay between instruments. When the piano eventually replaced the harpsichord, it opened up a completely different emotional vocabulary for composers.
So the instrument itself was driving the compositional style. That's a really interesting way to think about it. The tools shaping the art, not just the other way around.
That's exactly the right frame. And you see that pattern repeat throughout the entire history of the orchestra. Every time an instrument improves or a new one gets added, composers find new things to say. The technology and the artistry are always in conversation.
All right, so let's talk about the moment the symphony as a form actually gets invented, because I think a lot of people assume it's always been this grand, serious thing. But the origin story is kind of surprising.
It really is. According to the Violin Channel's History of the Symphony, the direct ancestors of the symphony were Italian opera overtures from the early 18th century, called sinfonias. These were orchestral introductions to theatrical performances, and they followed a fast, slow, fast three-section pattern. Their whole purpose was to prepare audiences for the drama to follow, without requiring serious attention.
So it was literally background music. Nobody was supposed to actually listen.
Nobody was supposed to listen carefully, right? And then something interesting happened. These overtures became popular enough that composers started detaching them from the theatrical context and writing them for independent concert performance. The warm-up act became the main event.
That is genuinely one of the great accidental success stories in art history. The thing nobody was paying attention to became the most prestigious form in Western classical music.
And the terminology shifted with it. Sinfonia originally just meant any group of instruments playing together. But by the mid-18th century, symphony was increasingly used to designate multi-movement orchestral works performed in concerts. The word grew into something much more specific and much more serious.
So who actually gave the symphony its structure? Because when most people think of a symphony, they think of that four-movement form: fast, slow, dance, fast, finale.
That structure came largely from the Mannheim school. The court orchestra at Mannheim, Germany, under director Johann Stamitz in the 1740s and 1750s, was doing something nobody had done before. According to the Violin Channel, the Mannheim Orchestra achieved unprecedented precision and discipline, and they pioneered effects that became standard, including the famous Mannheim crescendo, which is a gradual volume increase across extended passages, and sudden dynamic contrasts.
The Mannheim crescendo, I love that it has a name. Like, it was so distinctive it needed to be branded.
It was genuinely revolutionary at the time. And Stamitz and his colleagues also helped lay the groundwork for the four-movement symphony by adding a minuet, a dance movement, to the Italian overture's three sections. That four-movement template became the classical symphony's standard structure.
And then Haydn and Mozart take that template and run with it.
Completely. Britannica describes the classical era, roughly the second half of the 18th century, as one of the most significant periods in the development of orchestration, and Haydn and Mozart are the central figures. The orchestra became standardized during this period. The classical orchestra came to consist of strings, first and second violins, violas, violoncellos, and double basses, 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 2 or 4 horns, 2 trumpets, and 2 timpani.
That's actually a pretty specific lineup, like someone sat down and said, this is the orchestra now.
And Haydn was doing a lot of that deciding. According to Britannica, towards the end of his career in the London symphonies, Haydn introduced clarinets as a permanent part of the woodwind section. He also separated cellos from the double basses. Before that, they often just doubled each other. And he started giving woodwind instruments the main melodic line instead of always having strings carry the melody.
So Haydn is basically doing quality control on the orchestra, deciding what stays, what goes, what gets promoted.
That's a great way to put it. And he was also willing to experiment. In his military symphony, number 100, he introduced percussion instruments that weren't normally used in orchestras of that time: triangle, hand cymbals, and bass drum. And he put them in the second movement, which in classical tradition is normally the slow, quiet movement. That was a deliberate shock.
Haydn dropping percussion in the slow movement, that must have been genuinely startling for audiences.
It was a statement. And Mozart was doing equally important work on the other side of things. Britannica notes that his last two symphonies, number 40 and number 41, are among the most beautifully orchestrated works of that or any period. And for his 17 piano concertos, Mozart exhaustively explored the combination of piano and orchestra. He was essentially writing the rule book for how those two forces interact.
17 piano concertos. That's a lot of exploration.
It really is. And what's interesting about this period is that orchestration, the art of deciding which instrument plays what, was becoming a major factor in the artistic quality of the music itself. It wasn't just about the notes anymore. It was about the color, the texture, the blend.
Okay, so we've got this standardized classical orchestra, and then the Romantic period comes along and just blows it up.
Blows it up is right. The 19th century was a fertile period for the orchestra, according to Britannica. Woodwinds were increased from 2 to typically 3 or 4 of each instrument. The brass section was augmented by a third trumpet, third and fourth horns, and the inclusion of trombones. Composers like Berlioz, Wagner, Rimsky-Korsakov, Strauss, Mahler, and Stravinsky created orchestras of unprecedented size and tonal resources.
And Wikipedia notes that the typical orchestra reached a peak with as many as 120 players in the works of Wagner and later Mahler. That is a lot of people on one stage.
It's enormous. And the large orchestra, typical of the late 19th through the mid-20th century, incorporated an average of 100 performers, according to Britannica. Think about the logistics of that. 100 people who all need to be playing the same thing at the same time, in tune, with expression. Which brings us to one of the most interesting structural changes of the 19th century.
The conductor.
The conductor. According to the Phoenix Symphony's history, the first violinist, the concertmaster, used to lead the orchestra's performance from their chair. But as orchestras got bigger and bigger, all those musicians couldn't see and follow the concertmaster anymore. So early in the 1800s, conductor composers like Carl Maria von Weber and Felix Mendelssohn actually began to stand up on a podium and conduct from front and center.
So the conductor standing on a podium with a baton is literally a practical solution to a visibility problem. It wasn't some grand artistic statement, it was just, we can't all see the concertmaster anymore.
Exactly. The baton and the podium are engineering solutions. And then later in the 1800s, many composers, including Berlioz, Verdi, Wagner, Mahler, and Richard Strauss, also became conductors themselves. Their experiments with orchestration from both sides of the podium paved the way to the 20th century.
There's something really interesting there about composers needing to conduct their own work because nobody else fully understood what they were going for.
That's a real dynamic. When you're writing for an orchestra of 100 people with instruments that are constantly evolving, you need to have an intimate knowledge of what each instrument can actually do. The Phoenix Symphony's history makes the point that composers began to write for even more specific instruments, which meant a detailed knowledge of individual instrument sounds and capabilities was vital.
And speaking of pushing the limits, Arnold Schoenberg wrote a piece for a 150-piece orchestra. That's mentioned in the Phoenix Symphony's history, and it just stopped me cold when I read it.
150 players. That's not an orchestra, that's a small town. And it represents the absolute outer edge of the romantic impulse, this idea that more is more, that bigger means more expressive, more powerful, more emotionally overwhelming.
And then the 20th century pushes back against all of that.
Hard. According to Britannica, late in the 19th century, symphonies and orchestras had grown to such an extent that a reaction set in, culminating in the neoclassical movement of the early 20th century. Composers turned again toward principles of balance and formal discipline, using new techniques to achieve dynamic coherence. And economic considerations also forced a reduction in the size of orchestras and the amount of rehearsal time available.
So it wasn't just an artistic choice, money was part of it too.
Money is always part of it. You can't sustain a 150-piece orchestra indefinitely. And that economic pressure actually reinforced the artistic argument for restraint. The two forces were pointing in the same direction.
And the 20th century also brought in completely new sounds, electronic instruments, unconventional techniques.
The Classical Composer website describes the 20th century as a period where composers like Stravinsky, Shostakovich, and Bartók continued to innovate and expand the possibilities of orchestration. They introduced new instruments, expanded the size of the orchestra in some cases, and experimented with unconventional sounds. Composers like Schoenberg and Webern also experimented with tape music and other forms of electronic music.
So the orchestra that started as a consort of whatever instruments were available in the Renaissance ends up incorporating electronic instruments in the 20th century. That's a full circle in a way.
It really is. And the Phoenix Symphony's history makes the point that the 20th century has been a century of freedom and experimentation with the orchestra. It's also been a time of superstar conductors, as the conductor has taken on more and more responsibility and visibility. The conductor went from being a practical necessity to being the face of the entire institution.
Which brings up something I find genuinely fascinating about where orchestras are today. This tension between sticking to the canon and actually programming new or less known work.
That tension is real, and it's been studied. An Emory University thesis by Kevin J. Kelly looked at symphony orchestra repertoire choices using data from the League of American Orchestras. The research found that orchestras performing more distinct programs throughout the year are significantly more likely to move away from the traditional canon. And interestingly, older orchestras are also able to move beyond the canon and perform lesser performed works.
Wait, so the older, more established orchestras are actually the ones with more freedom to experiment? That's counterintuitive.
It is counterintuitive. You'd think the older institutions would be the most conservative. But the research suggests that institutional credibility gives them the freedom to take risks. They've already proven themselves with the canon, so they can afford to go somewhere unexpected.
And the Kelly study also found that orchestras are increasingly relying on both rigid, meaning the canon, and fluid, meaning innovative programming, to meet the demands of the 21st century. So it's not either or.
It's both, simultaneously, which actually mirrors the entire history we've been tracing. Every era has had composers who honored the tradition and composers who blew it up. Haydn standardized the orchestra and then put cymbals in the slow movement. Wagner expanded the ensemble to 120 players, and then Schoenberg went to 150, and then the neoclassicists said, enough, let's go back to basics. The pendulum always swings.
And the seating arrangement itself has evolved too, which I didn't expect to be interesting, but actually kind of is.
The Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra published a piece on this. The modern orchestra has generally accepted two standard models, antiphonal and non-antiphonal seating. The most common in the US is non-antiphonal, which has violin 1, violin 2, cello, and viola placed left to right in front of the conductor. But who sits where is a complex formula of history, acoustics, composer and conductor preferences, and stage design.
So even the physical arrangement of the musicians on stage is a product of centuries of evolution. Nothing about the modern orchestra is arbitrary.
Nothing is arbitrary. Every element, the instruments, the sections, the seating, the conductor on the podium, has a history behind it. And that history is always a negotiation between artistic ambition, practical constraints, and the technology available at the time.
Let's also talk about the American side of this story, because the orchestra didn't just stay in Europe.
Right. John H. Mueller's book, published by Indiana University Press, traces the growth of the symphony orchestra in America from its roots in European traditions. The New York Philharmonic dates to 1842. The Boston Symphony Orchestra was founded in 1881. The Chicago Symphony in 1891. These institutions grew up during the same romantic expansion we were talking about, and they brought that European tradition to a new context.
And the so-called Big Five American orchestras, the New York Philharmonic, Boston Symphony, Chicago Symphony, Philadelphia Orchestra, and Cleveland Orchestra, those are still among the most recognized in the world.
They are. And Mueller's work frames the American Symphony Orchestra as a social institution, not just a musical one. It's about community, about what a city values, about musical taste and how it's formed. The orchestra isn't just a collection of musicians, it's a cultural statement.
The Piano Encyclopedia actually has a quote that captures that. The symphony orchestra is no longer a mere entertainment, it has become a cultural institution. And when you trace the history, you can see exactly how that happened.
And it happened gradually, through all the steps we've been talking about. From Monteverdi specifying his instruments in 1607, to the Mannheim School inventing the crescendo, to Haydn standardizing the woodwind section, to Wagner demanding 120 players, to the neoclassicists pulling back, to 20th century composers adding electronics. Each step built on the last.
So when you step back from all of this, from the consort to the 150-piece Schoenberg orchestra to the modern institution balancing canon and innovation, what does this history actually tell us about music and culture?
It tells us that the orchestra has always been a mirror of its time. The Violin Channel puts it well. Understanding the symphony's history reveals not just musical development, but broader cultural shifts, from Enlightenment rationality, through romantic individualism to modernist experimentation and beyond. Every era left its mark on this form.
And those marks are still visible today. When you sit in a concert hall and hear a modern orchestra play, you're hearing 400 years of decisions about which instruments to include, how to seat them, who should lead them, and what music is worth performing.
Every single element has a story. The violin section replaced the viol family as social practices changed. The conductor's baton exists because orchestras got too big for the concertmaster to lead from a chair. The clarinet is in the woodwind section because Haydn decided it should be permanent. These aren't accidents, they're choices that accumulated over centuries.
And the repertoire question is still live. The Emory study found that orchestras are navigating between the canonical works and innovative programming simultaneously. That's not a problem to be solved, it's the ongoing conversation the orchestra has with its audience.
Exactly. And that conversation is what keeps the form alive. The orchestra that only plays Beethoven and Brahms is a museum. The orchestra that only plays new work loses its connection to the tradition that gives it meaning. The ones that do both, that's where the real vitality is.
Here's what this really comes down to. The symphony orchestra is one of the longest-running collaborative experiments in human culture. It started as background noise for opera, got formalized by a German court ensemble in the 1740s, standardized by Haydn and Mozart, inflated to 120 players by Wagner and Mahler, pulled back by economic reality and artistic reaction, and is now navigating the 21st century by doing both the old and the new at the same time.
And the fact that it's still here, still selling out concert halls, still being taught in schools, still inspiring composers, says something remarkable about the form itself. It's adaptable in ways that aren't always obvious from the outside.
So the next time you're sitting in a concert hall, or even just listening to an orchestra recording, think about what you're actually hearing. You're hearing the accumulated decisions of 400 years of musicians, composers, conductors, instrument makers, and audiences, all of them arguing about what the orchestra should be. And the argument isn't over. The warm-up act that nobody was supposed to listen to is still the main event.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of our Classical Music Discoveries Education Series. We hope this exploration has enriched your understanding and deepened your appreciation for the extraordinary world of classical music. As we close, we kindly remind our listeners that Classical Music Discoveries is not compensated by YouTube, nor do we receive any government grants. Everything we produce, every concert, every broadcast, every educational episode is made possible solely through the generosity of our listeners. If you would like to support our work, please use our safe and secure PayPal QR code appearing on your screen. Your donation, in any amount, directly sustains the music you love and keeps our programming alive for audiences around the world. We also invite you to check the show's description for information on how to advertise with us, how to have us highlight your own music, or how to become a sponsor of Classical Music Discoveries. Partnering with us is a wonderful way to share your artistry, your organization, or your message with our global audience. Thank you for listening, thank you for supporting, and thank you for being part of the CMD family. Until next time, keep the music alive in your heart.